Hey guys, it's Greg with Apple Explained, and today we're looking at one of the most infamous company rivalries in tech history, and maybe even all of business, and that is the rivalry between Apple and Microsoft. Now this topic was the second place winner of last week's voting poll, and if you didn't get to vote, make sure you're subscribed. That way the voting polls will show up right in your activity feed on mobile, and you can let me know which video you'd like to see next. So in order to understand how the relationship between Apple and Microsoft developed, we have to travel back to 1976, the year Apple was founded. The Apple I was released in early April of that year, and Steve Wozniak built it around the idea that it would run a custom version of Microsoft's basic operating system. When the Apple I system was phased out in September of that year and development on the Apple II began, Microsoft caught wind of it and asked Apple if they wanted to license a more full-featured version of BASIC. Steve Jobs declined, as they were happy with their version of the operating system, Wozniak wrote. But when they showed off the Apple II at the West Coast Computer Fair in April 1977, they were overwhelmed with complaints since their operating system didn't have floating point, which basically means the machine didn't understand numbers below negative 32,768 or any numbers above 32,767. As trivial as this might sound for consumer-level apps, it became a big problem as businesses began using computers for accounting and couldn't use the machines to process any sizable numbers. After Apple heard all these complaints, they ultimately licensed Microsoft's BASIC software for a flat rate of $31,000 or around $130,000 in today's money. This license, which ultimately created an operating system called AppleSoft BASIC, actually saved Microsoft from near bankruptcy. Microsoft had previously licensed BASIC to Commodore for their PET system and ended up losing a ton of money on the agreement. But the Apple II was a runaway hit, with over 6 million units sold over its 16-year run on the market. Now, when Steve Jobs approached Microsoft and asked them to write apps for the 1984 Macintosh, they jumped at the opportunity. Some of the first Microsoft productivity apps, known as Office today, were made with the Macintosh in mind. In fact, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint were all published in 1985 exclusively for Macintosh. At the time, the two companies were great partners and actually helped support each other's businesses, until Bill Gates and Steve Jobs had a disagreement about the management of Apple. Bill Gates was reviewing Apple's business plan and thought it didn't make much sense. They weren't planning on licensing their software to anyone. He brought it up to Steve, but the idea of licensing Apple's operating system to other hardware companies was unthinkable for Jobs. So Bill, being the clever businessman he was, went back to Washington and began development of Microsoft's own operating system with a graphical user interface called Windows. Now, when Windows 1.0 hit the market in November 1985, it was met with mixed reviews. The most striking thing about the Windows operating system was its curiously close resemblance to Apple's Macintosh System 1, with clickable icons, mouse and cursor interface, and multiple windows for multitasking. Now, Apple had licensed some bits and pieces of their own operating system for Microsoft to use, but the similarities went beyond minor details. Some journalists had high hopes that Windows would be a high-performing operating system, but it fell short of expectations, which tends to be the case with initial versions of software. And one of the most criticized aspects of Windows was its high system requirements, which meant users needed an expensive, powerful computer to run Windows properly. But despite all that, Windows 1.0 served an important purpose in the long run, since it became the core building block on which modern-day Windows is ran. So 2 years after Windows 1.0, Microsoft brought Windows 2 to market in the winter of 1987. This was an incremental release and introduced more advanced VGA graphics with 16 individual colors, keyboard shortcuts for pro users, and desktop icons for quick access to different parts of the operating system and resizable and overlapping windows, all of which were very similar to the Macintosh operating system. So when Steve Jobs saw Microsoft's Windows 2, he wasn't thrilled. He accused Gates of stealing Apple's user interface and style, but as much as he hated this, he knew Apple was in no position to take legal action against Microsoft, and shortly after the Macintosh was released, Jobs was replaced as CEO by then board member John Sculley. Now, Jobs advised Sculley not to sue Microsoft, or else they wouldn't be as willing to develop apps for the Mac anymore. And keep in mind that a huge selling point of the Macintosh was its massive library of software, so Microsoft abandoning their hugely popular suite of Mac apps would be platform suicide, which was part of the reason why Jobs didn't want Sculley to go through with the lawsuit. But another reason was that the case would be very difficult to win. The grounds of the suit were basically theft of the look and feel of the interface, which wasn't really something a company could copyright or patent. In spite of this, Sculley went ahead and brought Microsoft to court in July 1994, and the case was thrown out in September of the same year. The court ruled that Apple cannot get patent-like protection for the idea of a graphical user interface or the idea of a desktop metaphor under copyright law. Now, I should mention that in the middle of this whole ordeal, Xerox sued Apple for stealing the interface they were suing Microsoft for from their Xerox PARC system, but that case was thrown out as well. Anyway, Bill Gates appeared to be right about licensing an advanced operating system to different manufacturers, because their licensing of Windows ended up generating a whole lot of profit for Microsoft and essentially established their operating system as the standard, leading to a virtual monopoly on the computer OS market. Because by 1990, Windows ran on 84% of computers worldwide, and that increased to 90% in 1994. As Microsoft's market dominance grew and as they released newer and more advanced versions of Windows, the bitterness between Apple and Microsoft grew even more palpable.
I'm really sorry, folks. The presentation should be running. I just installed my new operating system, Windows 95.
Check your autoexec.com.
If you're looking for a computer that's easy to use, there's still only one way to go.
Get a Macintosh.
It became so tense that during an interview in 1995, Steve said Microsoft had no taste and that they just made really third-rate products. But that attitude didn't last long, because when Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1996, he enlisted the help of Microsoft to return the company to profitability. Microsoft invested $150 million in stock and paid another $100 million in compensation to Apple for various copyright infringements. When the deal was announced at Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference in 1997, Steve Jobs was met with a less than favorable reaction from the audience when a video stream of Bill Gates was projected on a 70-foot screen above the stage.
We could get him up on the stage right now.
Now, many years later, when Jobs looked back on this event, he regretted allowing Bill's head to loom over him on stage, since it appeared Microsoft was in a more dominant position. Now, this substantial investment from Microsoft helped Apple produce some of the products that made them the company we know today. A year after Steve was booed, he went back on stage and announced the first iMac, which was met with resounding approval by the media and customers alike. 3 years later, Apple shipped the iPod, securing Apple's reputation as a lifestyle brand as well as a tech company. Now, around 2006, what we know as Windows Vista was in public beta under the codename Longhorn, and similarities between Longhorn and macOS 10 weren't immediately obvious to customers until Apple began pointing them out during their keynotes. For example, OS X Tiger introduced a system-wide file search called Spotlight, and months later, a Windows beta included a search bar in the Start menu. And Internet Explorer 7 was a total redesign from the ground up in an attempt to compete with Safari, but that never really worked. That same year, Microsoft released the ultimate iPod killer called the Zune. The only problem was it never really reached the same level of success as the iPod. And to give you an idea of why Microsoft even decided to make the Zune, you have to remember that at the time, Apple had essentially total market dominance in the portable music industry. Their steps in releasing iTunes for Windows, creating different versions of the iPod for different markets, and changing the port from FireWire to a USB-powered 30-pin connector all helped Apple cement their position as the dominant music player brand. Now, Microsoft recognized this and initially tried to compete with iTunes by creating the MSN Music Store in 2004, but within a year, the library of songs on MSN Music actually decreased from 1.5 million down to 1.1 million due to awful sales numbers and Microsoft not investing many resources into the service. Finally, in 2006, Microsoft discontinued MSN Music to release the new Zune Music service along with the Zune 30 music player. To help create hype around their product, Microsoft ran some interesting TV ads, and also some pretty desperate marketing campaigns. For example, Microsoft hired 200 college students to be Zune masters on their campuses. They would promote the music player and host what were called Zune events. But unsurprisingly, those efforts failed to generate any meaningful level of excitement for the device. Now, the Zune 30 had a few features to make it stand out from the iPod, including a larger display, a built-in FM radio, and a navigation touchpad some critics found easier to navigate with, and the ability to share music files between other Zune users within a 30-foot radius over Wi-Fi. Over the course of 6 years, Microsoft would continue to upgrade the Zune and refine its design, introducing a smaller version which ran off flash storage to compete with the Nano, and a fully touchscreen version to compete with the iPod Touch, but resembled more of a 7th gen iPod Nano in size. At its peak, the Zune only accounted for 9% of the music player market, coming in behind the iPod's 63%. And at the time the Zune was being phased out, it was barely at 2% total market share. But Microsoft didn't let the Zune dampen their spirits, because weeks after the release of Windows 7 in October 2009, Microsoft opened their first retail store in Scottsdale, Arizona. The design of the store was, as Cult of Mac put it, a carbon copy remake of an Apple store, down to the light-stained hardwood floors, the cash wraps designed down to a T to resemble the Genius Bar in Apple stores, and the employees were even recruited from Apple stores in the area. But it wasn't a total copy though, since Microsoft invested $60,000 in touchscreen tablets and likely $1,000 more in widescreen video displays for customers to demo certain products. Now, in recent years, the blatant copying from Microsoft has subsided quite a bit. Sure, they released the Surface tablet, which was compared to the iPad in Microsoft's own ads, but there are quite a few signature features that separates it from any iPad released to date. Even more recently, Microsoft has begun shipping Microsoft-branded computers like the Surface Book and Surface Studio with their own unique design language. So looking back, it's easy to see why Microsoft and Apple had such a tumultuous relationship. Both have felt wronged by the other at some point, although most of their bitter feelings have slowly faded away in recent years. So that is how Microsoft and Apple became rivals, and if you want to vote for the next video topic, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.